used to do midweek missing persons cases, and I feel like recently there have been so many people who have gone missing, and it's important to get those stories out there, because the more exposure, the better. So, welcome back to Midweek Missing Persons. Today we are going to be talking about the disappearance of Dylan Rounds. And this case actually happened here in Utah. And I hadn't heard about it, but it was requested. And when I started looking into it, I realized it happened it was hours from where I live, but alright, let's get into it. Dylan Rounds was this all-American farm boy. His mom said that ever since he was a little boy, he would just follow his father and his grandfather around their family farm. And he was really, in his element on the farm. He loved helping out. He loved working in nature. He was never into, video games or social media or anything like that. Dylan went to Rigby High School in Idaho. But his dream after high school was to have his own farm, which I think is such a sweet dream. Now, the area where Dylan's family lived in Idaho was super expensive, too expensive for a 19-year-old to buy acres and acres of land. But one of his friends ended up telling him about this plot of land for sale in Lucin, Utah. And with the help of his grandfather, he bought 640 acres of land in Lucin. Now, I guess this land had been farmed before, but not for years, so it needed to be cleaned up. He needed to do a lot of work pulling brush and stuff, but it did have water rights, so it needed some love, but it had a lot of potential. So for 2 years, Dylan worked on this piece of land, and he was getting it into really good shape again. He wanted to have this prosperous farm and build a house on the land and just live out his dream in Lucin, Utah, which is kind of in the middle of the desert near Nevada. So he's doing it, he's living his dream, and then he just goes missing. And as of right now, while I'm filming this video, Dylan's first crop that he worked so hard to create is sitting untouched on his farm. The last known person to speak to Dylan was his grandmother. He had talked to her on the phone on May 28th, 2022, so this is 2 months ago. But this was a super brief conversation. He said he couldn't really talk because he had to get his grain truck in the shed because he had seed in it. He had been planting and he couldn't get the seed wet, so he was kind of rushing to get this truck put away in the shed because it had been raining, rainy weather. And his family didn't hear from him over the weekend. Dylan's mom couldn't get a hold of him, and she began to worry. But it never crossed her mind that Dylan might be missing, or that he would have met with foul play. That, never came up on her radar. Instead, she was worried that maybe there had been some kind of farming accident, and Dylan had gotten hurt, and he's out on the farm alone, just laying in the desert, unable to make it back to the RV camper that he was living in. So, Dylan's parents and his grandparents rush out to his farm, expecting that they would find him with a broken leg or a snake bite, but he would be okay. But when they got to the farm, they couldn't find him. Within the first hour and a half, they did find something that made them realize something was wrong. And what they found were Dylan's boots. So he has this shed on his property where he parks his grain truck to keep it out of the elements. And this shed is about 5 miles from where his RV is parked that he lives in, and he, at this point, is living out on this farm, all alone. So his family gets to the shed where the grain truck is parked because that is his last known location. And his truck is inside, and his boots were found about 100 yards south of the shed behind a pile of dirt, casually tossed. And this may not be super concerning to you or me, but this was concerning to Dylan's family. It was actually terrifying. Dylan's mom, Candace Roundy, told East Idaho News, quote, "He was very particular about his boots. He wears a pair, and it's always the same pair. And then, when they're completely worn out, he goes and buys another pair of the exact same boots." So basically, she goes on to say he doesn't have another pair of boots. He doesn't have a pair of tennis shoes that he wears sometimes. He has one pair of boots at a time. And so, finding them thrown behind a pile of dirt doesn't make sense, because he wouldn't have parked his truck in the shed, took his boots off when it was raining, and then walked 5 miles back to his camper, barefoot in the desert. There were also no tire tracks in the dirt leading up to or from where Dylan's truck was parked. And the weekend that he disappeared, it had been raining, so you would think there would be markings from the vehicle, but there was nothing. Dylan's mom also noticed that his truck had been pressure washed and was noticeably clean. And this isn't something that you typically worry about when you're working on a farm, your truck getting dusty. It would later be determined that Dylan had visited Montello, Nevada, which is the last place that anyone physically saw him. According to his mom, he would sometimes go to Montello to a bar and meet up with friends, but these friends never came out to Lucin to visit or hang out with the Dylan because there was nothing there. Candace Cooley also said they aren't sure if Dylan ever made it back to his farm after his visit to the bar on May 30th. The FBI got involved in this case the week of July 14th. Now, Dylan's parents are super frustrated with how law enforcement handled Dylan's case, like right from the beginning. So, she said since the FBI has been involved, they really got the ball rolling, and there are some things happening, but nothing she can discuss publicly. She was frustrated with how Dylan's disappearance was being handled, and she said, quote, "Nothing was done to treat this as if it were anything more than a kid walked out into the desert without his boots and is missing. There was no fingerprinting, no processing of his truck, his camper, nothing was done," end quote. And when asked if she thinks local law enforcement dropped the ball in the beginning, she responded, "Absolutely, 100%, and I will not go back on that." She went on to explain how law enforcement from Box Elder County came out on Monday, May 30th, when they reported Dylan missing, and they searched for Dylan, and by 2 o'clock the next afternoon they had called off the search and they just left. Then absolutely nothing was done between that first initial search and Friday, June 3rd. And that's when the Weber County Search and Rescue came out, but it wasn't the sheriff's office. The family, super frustrated with the lack of help from the police, started their own searches. They had family members and friends helping, but they had no guidance from police to help with these searches, like nothing. Now that the FBI is involved, and a lot of people think it's odd that the FBI is involved in a missing persons case, but I think it's possibly because of the location where Dylan's farm is. It's right on the Utah-Nevada border, and he was actually last seen in Nevada, but his boots were found at his home. So there's a very good likelihood that state lines were crossed in this case, and that may be one of the reasons the FBI did become involved. On July 7th, Utah deputies publicly named a suspect in Dylan's disappearance case. A 58-year-old man named James Brenner, who was squatting near Dylan's farm, was named a person of interest and was arrested on federal firearm charges. Once the arrest was made, Dylan's mom told the media James was an acquaintance of Dylan's. In court documents, James is described as a neighbor and a family friend of Dylan's, who was said to be squatting in a trailer on land near where Dylan's boots were found. So I'm not sure if he was found squatting in Dylan's trailer. There's still a lot of unanswered questions in this case, but the court documents describe him as a family friend and neighbor of Dylan's. He has a criminal history which includes malicious shooting, malicious wounding, and 3 prior convictions for being a felon in possession of a firearm. And the court documents state, quote, "The defendant has no work history and is currently unemployed and has no verifiable residence. The defendant was trespassing and squatting on property." Now, as part of law enforcement's search for Dylan, they searched serial number. After being contacted by the FBI, DH gave the weapons to authorities. Because of his past felony convictions, they charged Brenner with being a felon with possession of a firearm, and he pled guilty on May 21st and has already been sentenced to 33 months in prison for another firearm charge. And these latest court records were just recently unsealed. Chief Deputy Cade Palmer of the Box Elder County Sheriff's Office said, quote, "When Dylan Rounds was not located early on in the search effort, the investigation focused on the possibility of Dylan being a victim of a crime. The current totality of information gathered from the many interviews and searches, along with the analysis of both physical evidence and forensic data, has identified James Brenner as a suspect. No criminal charges have been filed specifically regarding the Dylan Rounds case," he said, "but this investigation is not complete and remains active. Law enforcement investigators are continuing their work to locate Dylan and find answers." So, investigators found 2 guns in his motorhome on May 12th. This was 2 weeks before Dylan went missing, and they were serving a search warrant for a different homicide investigation. They go into this felon's motorhome. He has firearms. So this guy obviously is like up to no good. Anyway, so he was already facing charges, and I'm sure that's how he came up on their radar. But basically the police issued like a very blunt warning that said if anyone has any information or was involved in Dylan's disappearance, they need to come forward because they will be found and brought to justice. They said, quote, "If someone's laying low that was involved in this or know something and they think they lay low long enough, we're going to go away. Well, that's not going to happen. We're going to keep at this until we get answers." Candace Cooley believes that James and Chase know what happened to her son. She says Dylan's case has been reclassified from a missing persons case to a homicide investigation. She said, quote, "We pretty much all knew it from the first day we went out there. We know our son, and we know nothing would take him away from his farm. Absolutely nothing. It was just one of those gut feelings where you don't want it to be true. It's a parent's worst nightmare. But when you have a kid like Dylan with his patterns, his drive, his passion, we just knew he wouldn't leave. There's no way." But despite the situation, his family is still trying to remain positive. Dylan's 20th birthday is coming up in a few days on August 1st, and his family is asking anyone interested to sow a seed for Dylan. Packets of black-eyed Susan seeds are being distributed through the Find Dylan Rounds Facebook page and will be available at different locations in Utah and Idaho. People around the world person's poster on your social media. Let's keep an eye out for any information. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I'll be back next week.